Presenters this afternoon, and we want to make sure that both of them have adequate time to cover their material. So if I could invite you to take your seats, and I want to introduce the chair for this afternoon. So welcome to the fourth keynote session for the conference, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Toma Belanda, who is the head of department of the School of Architecture and Planning, which is the academic department where the ACC is based at the University of Cape Town. Toma is also active in the EXCO of ACC and a very close friend and collaborator in the various bodies of work that we do in the center. You may also know of him because I know a lot of the guests into Cape Town have decided to make a pilgrimage to Zeitz-Mokke. He's just published a fantastic review in Architectural Review, so you may want to look out for that, apart from other earlier commentaries on interesting projects in Makoko and so forth. So Toma, thank you for chairing and welcome.
Thanks, Edgar, and good afternoon, everybody. And yes, it's a real pleasure, both in my institutional role of being the head of department of the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics, but also in my personal sort of capacity to be able to welcome you to this afternoon's session and to the conference in general. And because, as yesterday Edgar's mentioned, even though we are a Baroque university, I'm sure that my definitely does not try to enforce any sort of paper boundary to the activities of the center, which in fact was one of the main attractions when I applied for the job. So it's a real dream. And welcome again. So this afternoon's panel is titled Animating and Activating Citizens. And what we have heard over the last day and a half is the push for multiple voices to be heard. The energy and creativity that is not encapsulated in conventional, normalized professions, but instead wants to push the regulatory boundaries and frameworks, both as a gesture of maybe epistemic disobedience, but also as a creative and enriching tool. So this is clearly visible, and this is a pun, obviously intended, in the role participation, art, visual experimentation have as an attractive and aesthetic meaning of imagining new futures. And the not-so-easy relationships with architects, such as myself, as producers of form. And the intent of the session is therefore really to demonstrate visually the ways in which the two speakers that I'm about to introduce and their organizations have experimented with a variety of designs, artistic and cultural tools to animate urban public spheres. First, it's my real pleasure to welcome back to Cape Town friend and colleague Joy Mboya, a performer and cultural activist who currently stewards the Go Downs Art Center, a leading non-profit multidisciplinary arts facility in Nairobi, Kenya. A journey she started with a group of artists in 2003. Since then, Joy has led the center's development as a site for artistic experimentation, cross-sector partnership, and collaboration, making it into one of the most vibrant creative incubators of the continent, and organized the ongoing annual series of the Nainihu festivals. I'm sure you will be blown away by what she has been able to achieve, and please join me in welcoming Joy Mboya to the stage.
So good afternoon, and thank you, Toma, for your kind words. I will do two things, actually, is to take you through two projects that are related, that the Go Down Art Center has been involved in under this theme called Nainihu, and I should probably start by explaining what Nainihu means. You can probably guess the who part, that is English. And the Naini is actually Sheng. Sheng is the urban speak that evolves and morphs and changes continuously in the neighborhoods of Nairobi and in other urban spaces within the nation of Kenya. And so Nai is the abbreviation for Nairobi, Ni is the Kiswahili word for is, and who. So who is Nairobi? So Nai ni who is actually a question. Nai ni who is an interrogation of the notion of identity and belonging in the city of Nairobi using residents. And the image there that you see, again, you see something that says Naini Sisi. Now you can probably guess what that is. Nairobi is, Sisi is just we. We are Nairobi. How did we get into this project, this activity? The Godan Art Center is an art space that is now 15 years old. It's located in a warehouse on the edge of the industrial area in Nairobi. It's an old, dilapidated space that if you're a European visitor, you'll probably think, oh, this is cool, this is funky. You are squatting or taking over old industrial spaces and trying to bring arts into it. No, that is not what we were doing. We had no other choice. So we went into that space because there were no other spaces in which to establish an art center. But once we established ourselves, I think we very quickly understood within a space of 3 years that we had no idea about what an art center might mean in a new city, a growing city, a city full of migrants, a city full of people who are probably asking themselves whether the city is theirs or not, a city that was a temporal space, a temporary space for a number of its residents. And we were thinking about audience building. So we raised the question and said, what should we as an art center focus on in terms of programming for the residents of Nairobi? But then beyond that, we also said, we sit in a city. What does it mean to have a cultural space, an art center, within the city of Nairobi itself? So Naini Who is just one of the questions and one of the frameworks that we use to ask ourselves this question. But of course, some of the other programs and activities that we're engaged in also look at this issue in different ways. The iconography that you see over there, the question mark, is the iconography of the festival, and the festival is now 5 years old. So this year we will be celebrating the 6th year of the festival. But let me come back to the business of the arts, which is the business of the go-down. I think one of the things that is exciting around what is happening with Kenyan artists today is when you're looking at the trajectory of art since independence, is that the younger generation of artists, those who are probably in their 20s now, are actually not looking back at history or not drawing back on tradition in any way, but trying to imagine a future using creative expression. Up top over there, the Sea Stunners. Some of you may know the work of Cyrus Kabiru. His work is actually the images of these wonderful sculptural spectacles that he creates are sitting in the Zeitz. It's fantastic to see him occupy a whole room in that particular museum. When I look at Cyrus's work, I ask myself, what is it that we see through the lenses that Cyrus creates? What sort of future do we see? Cyrus, when you ask him why he makes these, he says, I am giving trash a second chance. And in a sense, I think he's sort of creating a second chance or a second vision for us, for the future. The head in the middle is Wangeshi Mutu, an artist who is much older than Cyrus. This is some of Wangeshi's new work, these heads that are reminiscent a little bit of the Benin bronzes, but work that she created in 2017, and she titled this work, The Dreamer. And again, for me, emotive of what are the dreams that we dream in African cities? What are the dreams that we dream as African citizens today about the kind of Africa that we want? Swinging around to the right, that is the work of actually an architect, a graduate architect from the University of Nairobi, but also a photographer called Mutua Madheka. Mutua loves to take photographs of the city, and he's taken lots of photographs of Nairobi. But then, of course, he uses technology to filter these images so that we see a different kind of a city. We imagine a city that is still perhaps hard, but a city that is modern, a city that looks clean, a city that looks futuristic. Again, a sense of what kind of cities, what kind of futures are these artists seeing. And then down there is another photographer, a young man called Osborne Macharia. Osborne also an architect, a graduate of the University of Nairobi. I wonder whether there's something going on there with the architecture program. They all end up becoming photographers. He has this fantastic visualizing of what we could be when we get older in the new future, the new Africa. This is an image of grannies, women who are probably corporate now and who will look like this in their 70s. And he's done a fantastic series of this is called Nyanyes in Sheng, a fantastic series of these images of people who get older, Africans who get older, and they're getting older in cities, I'm assuming. But then what do they look like in those cities? Who are they in those cities? So within the artistic space, there is a lot of interrogation, there is a lot of questioning around that future, our future. What do we look like? What is that identity of the African in the future? But for us at the Godan Art Center, we are interested in looking at this question from the grassroots, from people themselves. How does the ordinary Kenyan, how does the ordinary man and woman and child in the street interact with the arts and can interact with the arts to interrogate identity and belonging in the city and even possibly futures? And so Nainihu is actually that exploration. In 2010, it became clear to us that we were actually going to be owners of the space that we occupy in Nairobi. We had negotiated with a car company that was the owner of that property and finally signed an agreement. And that gave us a certain power, a certain agency. We began to ask ourselves, now that we are proprietors of the city, what can we do? One of the things, of course, we could do was to think about the future of our own space. Do we want to change it? What do we want to change it to become? But then we also said we have a responsibility as an actor within the city, an owner within the city, to think about the changes that we might wish to make and what the implications are for the neighborhood and for the residents themselves. So with collaborators from Europe, Sweden specifically, architects from Sweden very specifically, an architectural firm called White, we began a journey of exploration, experimentation, interrogation of this notion of identity in the city of Nairobi. How did we partner with White? This was just a question. We had been doing artistic exchanges with Swedish artists, and one day I asked one of my good friends, a Swedish guy called Pratik, I said, Pratik, I bet you know some architects who might be interested in going on a journey with us. And he said, sure. And I didn't believe him. But sure enough, the following year, he introduced us to the firm White, and we started this journey that we've been on together now with this firm for 7 years. And it's been a very interesting journey. But one of the first things that we did was to set up a series of workshops with artists, with city officials, with other architects and planners, with residents, around the question of identity. And what this threw up for us was what you might expect, actually, that we, of course, don't talk about this enough. The African presence in cities has been one that has been problematic, of course, colonial cities, cities that excluded or marginalized the African presence, and therefore the post-independent city or the post-colonial city then becomes a funny space, a space which we sometimes feel is not our space, a space which we sometimes feel we belong in, a space which enables us to disappear, to be able to do what we want to do, to get away from tradition, but also a space which we think can be alienating and not feeling like home. So we took these conversations and sort of said, what do we do with these conversations? How do we work with art to explore this from the perspective of the residents themselves? At first we thought exhibitions, exhibitions, exhibitions. And so we put out a call and said, a call to the city and said, give us ideas around what you think you would do as an ordinary Kenyan, as an art lover, around the question of identity. What sorts of things would you do? What sorts of activities might you curate or propose? And we received some, about 50 of them, some interesting ideas, some strange ideas, all wonderful, but actually very limiting in terms of representing what we thought could come out of Nairobi. And so we came up with this idea of a festival framework where we carved up the city into 12 zones, and each of those zones would then go into festivals curated by the residents in those zones themselves, selecting and celebrating the things that they felt represented who they are in those particular neighborhoods. And so Nainihu was born that way. So the top image is how we carved up the city into 12 bits. This is not the way that the city itself officially has carved itself up. We carved it based on how people name the neighborhoods, how people mark the boundaries for themselves, the road or the buildings or the change of activity that begins to delineate one space from another space. And so we had 12 areas, and in each of these areas, as you can see, we then had the very first Nainihu in 2013, which ended up, of course, as a 3-month-long festival, way too long, but really an excellent experiment in beginning to understand how to mobilize and work with residents themselves in the notion of curating. The second project, which is the one on the bottom, is the one that we continue to investigate with the architects themselves. And this we had a different name for. We called it Shukisha Nairobi, which is when you're in one of the matatus, one of the public transport, the vans, and you want to get off somewhere, you ask the tout to let you off. You say, Shukisha hapo, let me off there. So let me off in Nairobi is now the investigation and the exploration that we're doing with the architects around the question of the urban space, and then, of course, the architecture, cultural infrastructure within that cultural space. So just a little bit first about Nainihu, just to give you a bit more around how that works. We went into the neighborhoods. I guess you can hear me. We went into these neighborhoods and first had to, and first, of course, it's probably something magnetic. It's okay. I'll just speak. I'll project. Yeah.
Joy, we streaming, so we need the sound.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, of course. Hello, Nairobi. We're streaming. We need the sound. Of course, we had to go into the neighborhoods and identify collaborators. Our first collaborators, of course, were the artists who we had formed associations with because we were an art space. And then beyond that, of course, there were some community-based organizations who would do things with the art center. And so this is the way that we entered the space, the neighborhood space. It was really a pitch. We developed a big book, a pitch book, that had lots of pictures, lots of ideas about how a neighborhood festival might be. But of course, we said that this was not prescriptive. We then had discussions with the neighborhoods around the sorts of things that they felt were celebratory and representative of who they were in that area. And some of the things they came up with were very interesting. Some of them proposed cleanups as part of a festival. The markets inevitably became part of a festival. In some of the neighborhoods where you had homes for orphans and children with disabilities, that became a point of celebration. In neighborhoods where you had art centers, of course the art centers wanted to show what they were about. So there was quite a diversity of the things that residents selected as elements of celebration for themselves. But then as an art space, we also injected additional things. We supported the neighborhoods with concerts if they wanted to have a concert, with exhibitions if they wanted to have exhibitions within those spaces. But then we also pulled together certain other activities that we felt could be interesting in the discussion of identity and belonging. And these were dinners where over the internet, social media, we would put out a call and say, do you want to have dinner with this musician or that football player? And come and talk about living in Nairobi, being in a Nairobian. And this happened at the same time as the festival itself was happening. The social media, of course, was absolutely key in moving this along. Conversation that would happen on social media, but then, of course, the publicity that happened through social media. And if you're interested in following what happens with Nainihu, then, of course, we have a Facebook page, and hashtag Nainihu gives you a lot of information. The second thread, which is Shukisha Nairobi, was now a more difficult exploration because this required collaboration with city duty bearers, with the planners in the city of Nairobi. Of course, we have City of Nairobi as well, UN organizations who worry about the question of human settlements, and so they were collaborators in this process as well. And you had other architects, you had other technical people who were interested in this question and looking at this question. And so this particular collaboration was really around pulling together the experts, so-called experts in the urban landscape, in the built landscape, and having conversations between them and artists and residents to think about the development of the neighborhood of the Godown itself, and also very specifically the development of the Godown, the redevelopment of the Godown itself as a cultural space for a post-independent city. This process has actually been very interesting. I think we were just discussing with Michael, how did we make headway here? And I was explaining that I think one of the reasons why we made headway was the collaborations and the relationships that we forged. Who cares about a small art center sort of saying, let's do something about the city, let's discuss identity and belonging, let's include people, let them participate, let them take part. The way that people cared was because I think UN Habitat became interested in this question of a collaboration, a partnership between an international firm and a local cultural space, and began to include us in their workshops and in their conversations. And in their conversations, of course, was the city. And so the city began to sort of go, who is this art center? What are they about? What does culture have to do with this? And I think, fortunately, we had within the city a planner heading the department who was visionary and had foresight and said, this needs to be in these conversations. The others in this conversation, of course, were other actors who are looking at the question of the city. Civil society organizations engage with the city in different ways. And so through those conversations, we got to a place where we began to look at the design of the art space itself. How do we design an art space, an art center for Kenya today? Now, what was interesting was we discovered, of course, and we hadn't thought about this, is that since independence, actually, the city has not invested in new cultural build at all. And so when this is built, this will be the first post-independent new cultural build, which puts a bit of pressure on the whole thing. So, how was this thing built? Who was involved? What were the discussions? What happened there? With white architects, we've walked through a journey of trying to include as much as possible a representation of the entire city. Not just artists and students who are useful, of course, in research, but the residents themselves, children, the shopkeeper across the Godown who runs a kiosk, always a part of those conversations. Those who are involved in Nainihu, always a part of those conversations, trying to really understand the kind of space, the kind of art center that we should build. The kind of art center that we should build for Nairobi today. So I have, oops, I'm pushing the wrong slide. I have, and I was told to now go Alt-Tab, and, okay, before I hit the space bar, I have two short videos, just 2.5 minutes each, one that gives you a sense of Nainihu, and then the second one that gives you a sense of the space that collectively the residents of Nairobi seem to be shaping with architects. So the first video is to give you a sense of the messiness, the vibrancy, the feeling of Nainihu through some of the activities that we've had.
naitwa Madingo, kutoka chwani, kutoka mbio, nikitisha inganga na kutisha somoja, kikwambia nitegee na kwambia wengoja, unashuka nini wacha kujitisha, kutia blanda ni kujiingiza, nikiongea naye poa na kusikiza, kupigwa na makarao ni kuvaliwa, unaweza kupiga simu nango sina kitu, chali yangu umechara una kitu, baadaye nakuona umebamba kwa mbulu, kushia kitu ni sulu bin sulu, kuna sheng ya isich, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya kibich, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya emba, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya marish, lakini si wote tunaelewana, manzi msupa naitwa mtoto, manzo uduna ni yongongo, ukiocho matani umejokwa, kuingiza mawinzi mingi ni kuomoka, ukitwa dwanzi ni kumitwa fala, kuvurugwa ni kulazimishwa kuhama, kitu noma sana ni mambo mbaya, kwanza kazi ile chujo lukumevaa jana, kuwa mpole mtu wangu ni sifa tu, na kutoshanisha na kupima tu, punguza keki mzee utafyatuka, kitu na teni kitu inanuka, kuna sheng ya ungwaro, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya pango, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya Salem, lakini si wote tunaelewana, kuna sheng ya unge, lakini si wote tunaelewana, gang gang, au si
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The Go Down Arts Center is a non-profit organization which began 14 years ago in an old warehouse on Dunga Road, Nairobi. It set out with a transformational vision of a cultural future for us all. A future created from the dreams of many different Kenyans to build a successful, sustainable relationship between society and arts and culture. In a collaborative process that took over 7 years, with architects, city planners and artists, residents, city officials and students, the vision has been shaped while taking into account the growing city and the immediate surroundings. The Go Down's plans for a new public access arts complex in Nairobi are historic, as this will be the first significant investment in cultural infrastructure since Kenya's independence over half a century ago. On entering the new Go Down, you step into the first courtyard, a welcoming space connecting galleries, library, auditorium, museum, offices and restaurants. A wide staircase leads into a second courtyard with dance studios and offices for artist organizations and businesses. In a third and intimate courtyard are 2 stories of visual artist studios for painting, sculpting, installations, and mixed media. There is a tower block within the arts complex, housing a boutique art hotel, which will provide income to help sustain the diverse programs of the center. Included in the 5 levels of the complex are underground parking, film and music studios, craft workshops, conference rooms, and training labs. Support our vision and be a part of the transformation of Kenya's cultural future. So thank you very much. So you can also follow that. You can also follow the progress of that on #GoDownTransforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joy. And now, ideally moving across the continent from East to West Africa, our second speaker comes from Port Harcourt on the shores of the Niger Delta, where Michael Uwemandimo is a co-founding partner and director of the collaborative media advocacy platform CMAP. A founding member of the filmmaking collective Vision Machine and producer of Oscar-nominated BAFTA-winning The Act of Killing, he has been developing innovative approaches to documentary practice as a means of enabling critical reflection on histories of political violence and challenges to official impunity. In his 190 slides, 3 videos, and only 7 minutes of talking, he will share with us the story of the Human City Project. And he maintained remaining within the allocated time frame so that we can have a conversation afterwards. Thank you. Join me in welcoming Michael.
Hello. Lovely to be with all of you. I'd like to really quickly tell a story about what we're doing in Port Harcourt, about a project that we're developing called the Human City Project. Before I say anything about the city or the project, I just want to show you a short video that will give you a sense of the context, in which we'll come back to a little later. It's 3 minutes.
They came 7:30. They came with their bulldozers and they came with their soldiers.
Yeah, this way. Front, go front. Step side. That side, may go this side. Police on that side, you cannot come this side. Come this way. Come inside. Come and see.
After the demolition of my place, I don't have where to stay. I hung around for 2 weeks. No money. I don't expect that day they will come and demolish that place with one day. So now I hang around with my children, with 6 children. I hang around, I have a place to stay. Even to have money to pack my things to fly, I don't have. Me, I'm not a lazy woman. I'm not a criminal, I'm not a militant. I'm a struggling woman. I do business. I do petty trade, rice, beans, tomatoes. I sell. I go to and buy things and sell. I'm not a lazy woman. I'm an industrious woman. I do business. I'm a struggling woman. And now the government frustrates me. There's no way to. Even all my property was scattered, my things, my business was scattered. No way to start even the business. No way to manage. No way even to put my children in the school. That place is our home, where we brought up. Are we supposed to be refugees in our own lands?
We are saying that we are not wicked, but we are here to develop our community. Daddy, the God of heaven has given us the power to bring up the young ones that are perishing and hopeless. Hunger strike, Papa. Jesus, we will not suffer because of your wisdom. Let the men be in their area. We will not tolerate any form of criminality in this community. We are saying, please leave us alone, oh, let us stay in our place. So, without noise and violence, Daddy, Kroma, your lawyer. Tamuna Basisi, watch it, Kroma.
So, as most of you perhaps know, Port Harcourt is the oil capital of Nigeria. It's in this tangle of creeks in the Niger Delta, and for 500 years, this part of the world, this swampy elbow of Africa, has been part of a globalized trade in dark cargo. First of all, human beings, then palm oil, then coal, and now sweet crude. This violence of extraction has been embedded into the fabric of the city. The material violence of extraction and the social violence of segregation is there in the formal plans of the master planners. But all those formal intentions have long since been exploded by very rapid oil-fueled growth. And that has not only destroyed the dreams of the master planners, it has simply destroyed. Nigeria is sometimes the largest, sometimes the second largest producer of oil on the continent. And at a conservative estimate, 10% of production is informal. A lot of it goes into what we see here, artisanal refining, quaintly called. And the impacts of this are profound. So this is the context, this is the horizon that we work in. And all around the creeks that fringe the city, people have taken mud, Chikoko mud, and reclaimed the creeks and built these very dense waterfront settlements. This is just the southern tip of the city. About 500,000 people live in these waterfronts. And in 2009, they were all declared for demolition. Now, the official imaginary, the official vocabulary is one of marginality. But of course, this is the core urban condition. 70%, at a conservative estimate, of all Nigerians live in slum conditions. This is the national condition. And yet, there is no national engagement. There is no state presence apart from the occasional bulldozer. And so we see the kinds of problems that we're used to seeing, problems of sanitation, insecurity, prejudicial policing, stark insecurity. But also we see the resourcefulness, the energy that we would expect to see in communities that have built themselves, and literally in these cases built the land that they stand on. And so where there's small-scale problems, they can respond with small-scale solutions. What they can't do is what states need to do. And for that, you need a policy that engages with urban reality. But the policy is this, essentially. For the most part, ignore and occasionally bulldoze. And it's a militarized form of urban development, or a kind of unmaking of the city. This is our former governor, who's now the Minister of Transport, the Federal Minister of Transport. So I think it's just worth looking at some of these images, because very often forced evictions, demolitions, are kind of relegated to a technical, domestic affair. But in a country where 2 million people have been forcibly evicted in a decade, we see scenes which look like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Post-tsunami, earthquake, or perhaps a war zone. So this is where we work. And of course, everyday life reasserts itself very quickly. What we've been trying to do is create space for other stories. It might seem perverse in the face of that overwhelming and very immediate violence to start the cinema, particularly when you consider that that first demolition we saw was carried out to make way for a cinema. But if you think back to that first clip, you notice how people, even as their houses are being destroyed, start directing my camera, telling me what to film. Film this, film that. With all that was happening, with the immediate existential threat, they saw in the camera that I was holding an instrument that they could use to literally frame what was important to them, to tell their story, to show what they wanted to be shown. And someone mentioned in a panel yesterday that not only propositionality, but positionality is important. And I think the fact that the camera was where it was, and Chris Marker in Le Joli Mai, I think, says that or Grin Without a Cat, that in a riot, power is very concretely spatialized. And the same in a demolition. You have a row of bulldozers, a row of soldiers. There's that side and then there's the other side. And the camera was on that side, so it belonged to them. I got arrested that day, and the people who you see guiding me around smuggled the camera away, got it back to me, cut together a little piece, sent it to Amnesty International, and they used it as part of a global campaign called Demand Dignity, and then sent it back to me with their logo on the back. And we took it around communities like the ones that had been destroyed on a little screen. And what happened was that people recognized themselves, sometimes literally, but they recognized themselves as recognized. People who had been treated as if they were invisible suddenly saw themselves as highly visible as part of an international campaign. And that had a really powerful mobilizing effect. So we thought we'd go with this a little bit, add a little theater to the cinema, and we got this big blow-up screen. And that's how we started with Chikoko Cinema. And the community that you see on the screen there is the community that the screen is in. The community literally frames itself. And that moment of recognition and this act of self-framing, I think, are there at the foundations of the project. This a film, Dear Mandela, from here, it just very quickly became clear that this was a very powerful way of animating people, of gathering people. So we thought about exploring different spaces of representation, the screen and the street. We wanted to get what was essentially the urban majority visible, even though they were literally shaping the face of the city. They were somehow invisible. And so we just wanted to make a very simple statement. This poster was pulled down within 2 weeks by the governor, and he revoked the license of the company that put it up, because that simple statement of fact, people live here, is obscene to the official discourse. It's inadmissible. This is Prince. You might recognize him from the first clip. That was the moment I saw him with that camera, and the camera I filmed him with is around his neck there, and he's now the project media officer. So we were thinking of layering forms of representation. So the next form we looked at was legal representation, how people could represent themselves in court. And earlier we had given cameras to people at a demonstration, security forces had opened fire, people had been shot, and we took the government to court, to the ECOWAS court, the regional court. It was a long drama, but 5 years later, this is the moment that we won. This was Joy, who was shot, and this is her hearing the verdict, Joy by name, joy by nature. So that's the context for the Human City Project. essentially, we wanted to just let people in. We wanted to remain rooted in the community, but to have an impact at city level. And we wanted to move from social exclusion to participatory development, from opposition to proposition. That was a really early strategic move. And when we spoke to people and asked what was important to them, they said voice. And when we asked what it would mean to build a platform for community voice, we got a very literal response. We want a radio station. So the idea of building a community radio station was the first impulse. So with Anna Bonaldo, we started that process, and very quickly it became clear, as well as developing a space for voice, we would need to design a space to house that voice. So that introduced an architectural component, which took us on a long and interesting journey to design and build a media center. It was clear to us very early that it was important not to fetishize architecture, to fetishize a building. We wanted to keep moving from the building to the site, to the neighborhood, to the rest of the city. And so we developed a participatory mapping program, which feeds into a series of small-scale, high-impact pilot projects, which feeds into what we call the People's Plan, because people are conspicuously absent from the Master's Plan. So that's the structure of the Human City Project. I was going to show you a little video which gives the big idea, but I won't, because we're running out of time. So I will just show you a few more images. This was the beginning of the architectural process. We wanted to start small so that we could make mistakes without those mistakes becoming catastrophic. So we built what we call the media shed. It's a shed. It's also a recreational space. It's an exhibition space. It's the town hall. And it's a large gathering space. It's powered by the sun, which means it's literally a light at night, so people come and plug in their phones and do their ironing. And it's also was home to our first training studio for Chikoko Radio. So we've now been through a long process, 3.5 to 4 years. We've trained a core cohort of 40 people and a broader network of community correspondents, about 70 people. And we're ready soon to launch. We now have a couple of linked broadcast studios. These are the new studios. And we've converted the shed into our music production space. So these people really feel like they're the custodians of their community's voice. This is Tammy interviewing the president of the Red Cross about urban violence. So, Chikoko Space is our more ambitious architectural project. This is Kunle Adeyemi there, an architect we've been working with. And before we started even asking questions about spatial design, we asked what kind of values people wanted the building to embody, what kind of histories they wanted it to explore, what kind of futures they wanted it to reach out to. So we went through a long process of workshopping, an iterative design process, and got a series of concept designs back. Those were workshopped. Everyone was involved. Was going to play you a little radio drama, but I won't. But it's fun. And we moved from here to here, to here, to here, to here, which is a render. And we can talk about the significance of renders and what they mean in the whole process. But we do intend to make this render out of steel and wood and fiberglass. So one thing to note about this is that to deliver a civic scale building in a really dense settlement, we had to float half of the building on water, the other half in air. And what that does is with the radio studios, a space of open public debate, open up an open public space. So this relationship between open public discourse and open public space is a key driver of the project. Just very quickly want to show you some images from the mapping project, because it was important to us from the beginning that our representational forms, our creative forms, were also able to be spatialized in the community. We're also able to issue into services, facilities, spaces that were concretely useful for the community. And to do that, we had to have really good data. And to do that, we had to have really good data collection teams and really good data analysis. And we have a really good community mapping team. As you can see, the outputs are quite high quality. This is some of the banners that we hung up in the shed. So, in the last 4 minutes, I'm going to show you a video from the latest component of our project, which is called Sessions in the Shed, which is our music component. Now, I should just say, as by way of context, that the first performance we did at Felibration was on October the 12th, which was the anniversary of the shooting at Bundu, which was the shooting we took the government to court for. And those of you who know Fela's Zombie will recognize this reversion. But here it's a reversion about the government treating its citizens like zombies, telling them to pack out of their houses, that they don't have right to land, to change their names, and then people speaking back and saying, we're not zombies. So this is that.
You want to develop the place. You say it's for the good of the people. I start killing the people. This state now, you don't trust anybody. Anything can happen. I think we do something swiftly to save their lives.
Got me looking like zombie. More problems, my brother, how it's gonna be? Cause the things I they get and the things I they see, I they feel say my people they hungry. I'm bringing back what belongs to me. I'm from the city where you work in 24/7 and you ain't paying no money. I'm from the city where you talking freedom, they put you for jail. It's not funny. Yeah, I got to right my wrongs to know my rights. I got to sacrifice to live this life. When the police acting like they owe me life, they make me pay some money, that's bribe. Don't be looking like criminals. Why they take me for a militant? Don't be looking like criminals. Why they take me for a militant? Yeah, yeah.
All in a spec, you not hear us. We no be zombies. Our land don't be graveyard. We get children like you. We get families like you.
go turn. Them want turn us, but we no go turn. Don't be yo. Attention. Active. Go and scatter.
Some bees no get brain to think. Some bees no they protest you. You send your tractors to the grave. What you forget in the grave now? Why you come and tell us to vote to you when you know say our votes no count? Why you dey do your campaign when you know say we know dey your mouth? Hey, on pop, hey, leave your house. I said change your name. They for the map. That's the right to land. Don't be going pop. Leave your house. Change your name. They for the map. That's the right to land. We don't let my belly. We not no negotiation. We want society. You wanna get the money. You wanna get the money.
So we got an invitation to Celebration 3 weeks before Celebration, and we didn't have a band. So this is what happened after 3 weeks. And they played the first night at the Shrine, Fella's Shrine, and Yenny Kuti invited them to play the next night at Freedom Park. And at Freedom Park, Ricky Stein, Fella's last manager, was there and loved them and signed them on an 18-month contract. So that was very sweet. And because I couldn't show you the little video, I have a 43-second thing, which is the big idea in 43 seconds. Done.
It's a floating station over the waters. Check a clean sound. Nothing waterside radio. We rock the city. We map the city. Check a cinema. Press the waterfront people. Can you hear a voice louder than bullets? Broadcast from a slum. We are young. We are strong. We are smart. We're from the slums. Music make a city feel this information is
Well, thanks again to Michael and to Joy. And now we're going to just spend another 5 or 6 minutes maybe trying to add something intelligent to this, which is impossible, I know, to this amazing presentations. And I'm going to try and facilitate maybe just a small exchange. And the first thought that really came to my mind is that maybe the title of the session was imprecise, because it ran animating and activating citizens, but it seems clear that citizens are pretty animated and active on their own terms. They don't need us, right? And so I'm wondering if you can sort of like reflect on the fact that we can offer other ways and platforms that facilitate that, but we don't need to put energy into energy which is already there, right? And it is a reaction, obviously, to rage conditions of struggle which are untenable. And so it seems to me that maybe just reflecting on the form of the verb, right, from an active to another way, could be one way to start a dialogue. Thanks. I don't know who wants to go first, Joy? Or?
No, I think you're right, Thomas. I know that when we first started this festival, we tried to be invisible. We actually didn't say who was starting the festival. We had billboards. We just put stuff out, and everybody was thinking, what is this? Which corporate is bringing this? Because I think that people can do things for themselves, as very clearly seen in both your work and the things that we're doing in Nairobi. And it's how to provide platforms. And then once you provide the platform, I think there's always the expectations that come with it. And I don't know whether you experience that. We have experienced in some of the work that we're doing that having run the festival for 5 years now, there's, so what are you going to do for us? And we have to keep going back to the conversation around what are we going to do for us collectively rather than what is the Go Down going to do for you? So that's just a question, yeah. But then just my response to that. But then beyond that, I think that what was interesting to just see in your work was music. It's visual. You're a filmmaker, but the music is so important. The music is so powerful. And how much that touches somewhere else, different from the ideas that struck me.
So on music first, it was actually the last component of the project. It's the newest one, but from the very beginning, we saw how important music was. At demonstrations, people were always singing. At protests, people were always singing. And in the radio studios that we built, people were always making music. So we just wanted to create a space where they could do that with greater facility. And we've always said many voices make a city, and this is one way of allowing more of those voices to be heard. And interestingly, it was the musicians who first got most kind of hard-nosed and concrete about sustainability. How can we offer services to other people so we can keep the studio going? They were the ones who really started thinking in terms of a kind of a radical social enterprise very, very early on. And in terms of animating people, I mean, what we found at the very beginning, when there was an immediate and existential threat, was we could get thousands of people out onto the streets like that. And as we succeeded, as we got more and more successful, and by succeeding, the threat receded, our question was how to animate people around digging a ditch or carrying out 6,000 household surveys with the same passion.
Right, and I think that is intriguing. But I just want to go back to the music aspect for a second, because you mentioned, Joy, at the beginning that what you were looking for is what lenses do artists or youngsters look at the city through. And the metaphor of lenses, the way of looking at things reflects on what is the theory, as the etymological root of the word. And so how maybe what surfaces very strongly is that we might need audiovisual, acoustic and visual ways of experiencing that also in, for instance, education, also in the practice, so that there's something about the static dimension of a map that is simply not enough to reflect the complexity and the intriguing richness of the lives that we're looking at. So I don't know if that's something specific of the Africanness of it, being obviously a foreigner in the continent, but I think there's something that really surfaces very strongly in how these audiovisual textures and lenses are helpful in reflecting on it, and it speaks back to what is the voice, and the voice is not just being the word, but then a more melodic and kinetic seems to me experiential point. So I don't know if that's also something that you can speak back maybe from your experience with visual productions.
We're developing a project with Google's special Street View Special Collections team called Narrative Geographies. And the idea is to somehow stage street theatre that's embedded in Street View. So to bring the map alive and to make it live, but also to make it a living archive that's audio-visual. No idea what that means or what it's going to look like, but we have an actual collaboration, so we'll find out soon enough.
And I think the audio-visual is actually our daily experience. We don't see or comprehend or understand things just from thinking about it. We hear, we see, we feel, we move. And I think I think it's true, and I think what's interesting around the notion of the festival, when I think about the Nainihu Festival, is that it is allowing people to use all of that in curating what they think a festival is. All of those experiences of seeing, feeling, touching, doing, wondering, asking, questioning, so expanding, using all of the senses in a sense to try and ask and investigate and question. And that is challenging for an artist, for the arts, because we tend to segment and we say we're now in an exhibition and we're looking at this, or this is now painting, or this is now sculpture. And I think what the community reminds us is that some of that sometimes is not very useful in looking at things sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I would love to go on for a very long period of time and continuing these conversations, but Edgar has just repelled me a lot. So thanks again for the inspiring thoughts, and over to Edgar. Thanks.
Those of you, we're going to go to panel 48. There's one error in the program. It's not in it should be in the Leslie 1E and not in St. Live's 1E. Okay, so panel 48. J Bob's live at 6:30 in this theater. Going to be a lot of fun. Be here. And then we've got a mini book launch celebration event in the Leslie building at 5. And then tomorrow, the university is being invaded by the parents of the new students. How dare they? I know. But it does mean the parking is on a first-come, first-served basis. So get here early, and you can suck it to the parents. Then what else? Yeah, no, that's it. Catherine, anything else? Okay. And obviously, enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you at 5 in the Leslie building for the book launch. Yeah. Oh, sorry, apology. Then this is wrong. The book launch is here in the new lecture theatre. Okay, sorry, thanks.